Darkness. You hear nothing save for the distant howl of wind which forsakes the otherwise still midnight air. You suddenly become all too aware that you are alone, as a restless anxiety makes its way up your core. The horrors of the night have become all too real, and illuminated only by candlelight, you walk the forsaken halls of this fell fortress, through labyrinthine hallways facing forgotten horrors along the way. Will you survive the night? Or will you fall victim to the curse of these halls? Castlevania. Castlevania is a game series that means a lot to a lot of different people. For me personally, where it started is actually right here, this exact DS, and not in the place where you might think, because it actually started using this bad boy. Yeah, I know you know what you're looking at. Pretty much everyone who's approximately my age had one of these, as far as I'm aware anyway. And they're basically a pirate's wet dream. I had an experience with the classic games on there via emulators, and also played Dawn of Sorrow, Portrait of Ruin, and the other one, Ecclesia. Cool stuff, dude. Here we are today. The beginning. The year is 1986. The Famicom was making waves in the gaming industry. Business as usual at Konami HQ. Enter Hitoshi Akamatsu, a major film nerd and lover of cinema. He would become the director of the project that would soon be named Castlevania. Relatively little is known about the development of the game. It was originally made for the Sharp X68000, a Japanese home PC, released in 1986 as Akumajo Dracula, before later being ported to the Famicom Disk System, and finally the NES, where it was renamed Castlevania for a Western audience. It's definitely important to note that major compromises were made when porting this game to the NES. For starters, the X68000 version has a genuinely really impressive opening cutscene, and the graphics, it's night and day. There's parallax scrolling, there's multiple layers going on, wider variety of colours, crazy animations going on, so on and so forth. The sound is much richer in the X68000 version. And there's also a save feature, which to be fair, was present in the Famicom Disk System version as well, but unfortunately for the NES version it had to be dropped. There's also a couple features which in development were scrapped, such as multi-directional whipping, like you can see in Castlevania 4. Allegedly there were also some power-ups that were cut, including one which allows the player to transform into a werewolf. Pretty sick if you ask me. At any rate, Akamatsu had a goal in mind, and that was to create a distinctly cinematic experience, as well as to pay homage to some Universal classics, among others. Dracula, Frankenstein, Boris Karloff, Christopher Lee, etc. They're all over this game. There's kind of a film motif all over it, as well as having all these classic horror monsters. The game actually starts off with a cutscene, which is kind of strange for the time. Remember, this is the early days of the NES. Starting outside the castle is honestly an amazing choice, I think, in terms of pacing for the game. You see the ominous structure looming above. You know there's no turning back. And as you enter the gates, your mind races as you wonder what horrors will come for you. Of course, nowadays, we don't really care about seeing this kind of thing. It's the norm, right? We expect cutscenes in games. Regardless, this would be a very different game, don't you agree? Chapter 2. Peace. In my opinion, Castlevania is kind of defined by a handful of things, the most pressing of which is the sense of pace. You really need to be very confident in your movement, which includes watching, waiting, and knowing when enemies are going to attack, and striking whenever you see the opportunity. Famously, the whip locks you in place, and missing can be extremely costly as a result. Likewise, once you leave the ground for a jump, you can't steer or essentially control Simon in any way apart from throwing daggers or swinging your whip, etc. No movement. As well as this, mistakes can be extremely costly. Every hit you take not only takes a considerable chunk of health, but knocks you flying backwards, usually to your death. A single mistake can spiral massively out of control into an unwinnable situation, and trust me, it'll happen more often than you think. As a result of all this, the controls can come across as quite stiff in this game, and that's kind of where you have to make up for it using your intuition, and of course, Subweapons. Subweapons, items, and kit. So, this is where subweapons come in. Subweapons are a hugely important part of the game, and depending on whether or not you're well equipped for a segment, they can make the game significantly easier, or significantly harder.
Welcome to the
Castlevania Subweapon.
Spotlight.
The knife is completely useless. The axe throws an axe in a vertical arc. It can be used to effectively anti-air enemies, and sometimes can be used to attack from a long range. Not the most reliable weapon, but it does have its uses. Makes the bat fight a lot easier. The cross. The cross is quite similar to the knife, but objectively better in every single way. You can throw it, and it'll return to where you threw it from. You can either collect it and throw it quicker, or let it fly all the way to the other side of the screen. The cross is pretty OP, in my opinion. The holy water. The holy water throws a vial directly in front of you, which briefly bursts into flames. The flames do damage over time and can be used to stun lock enemies. It's generally considered to be the strongest subweapon in the game. It's definitely the cheapest subweapon in the game. It's pretty broken. The stun lock is super overpowered and turns even some bosses into a complete joke. Look at this Medusa fight. The stopwatch. The stopwatch is one that seemingly everyone forgets about. It has a couple niche uses. It can, quote, stop time, which basically means enemies and projectiles, platforms and things of that like don't move for a couple seconds, although the stage timer still counts down, so it's not really stopping time, I guess. It doesn't work on bosses though, so unfortunately its uses are pretty limited. Now, since we're talking about subweapons, let's discuss the other items. You can collect these Roman numerals, which allow you to have more weapons on screen at once. 2 means 2, and 3 means 5, if you didn't already know that. Gosh. If you collect a new subweapon, you lose these numerals, so the game somewhat incentivizes holding onto one subweapon for a long time. You're kind of losing raw firepower every time you switch. The rosary is a rare drop from enemies that essentially clears the screen. The potion, another rare drop from enemies, gives you several seconds of immunity. Pretty useful, although they're so rare that you rarely actually get any decent use out of them. There are also money bags. That's right, there are points in this game. 30,000 points gives you a 1-up.
It's important to remember at this time that there wasn't really a concrete distinction between arcade gaming and home/console gaming. They were kind of one and the same, which led to a lot of arcade conventions sort of leaking into games where they really have no place being. Case in point, the points in Castlevania. The game doesn't track high scores, so need I say any more?
Hearts are the ammunition for subweapons. These can be found in candles and pretty much anywhere in the game. Small hearts are worth 1, big hearts are worth 5. You can also upgrade your whip twice by collecting this thing, whatever it is. Once upgrades it into the Morning Star, and then finally to the Vampire Killer. First increasing damage, and then increasing range, respectively. And last but not least, there's the Wallmeat.
Chapter 4.
Wallmeat, exploration, and risk versus reward. Castlevania is not a game that holds your hand. At all. Enemies take huge chunks from your health. 3 to 4 hits kills your ass in the later stages, and throughout the whole game, there's not a single healing item to be found. Unless
you hear your stomach growl. The last fathoms of energy are starting to leave your body. You grow desperate and search the very mortar of the walls in hopes of finding something to sustain your hunger. Against all odds, you find a delicious pork chop.
Well, apparently that's what it is. Doesn't really look like one though, but the manual says so.
Your hunger fades, and your courage returns as you march onward.
that's right. The only way for you to heal in this game is to slap bricks and find a delicious
Succulent Chinese meal.
waiting for you. I don't exactly know how people were expected to figure this out back in the day. Probably by accident, to be honest, because when you break a wall the first time, a little light bulb goes off. Hey, wait a minute. Maybe there's actually more of these. So you start checking. Every wall makes your mouth water at the thought of deliciousness, and more importantly, health. I think this is a great thing about Castlevania, to be honest, and it's something of a tradition that still continues. It's somewhat of an NES trope, to be honest, having hidden items in cryptic places. Everyone knows about bombing walls and burning bushes in Zelda, and this is somewhat similar. On one hand, I see it as a way to reward players who are actually willing to turn every stone, play through the game over and over and over again. And you couldn't fit a massive game onto a cartridge, so you had to make it replayable as sort of a compromise. But on the other hand, the more cynical side of me sees it as being kind of a example of game design, not being able to find a good place to put it in plain sight, you know, kind of needlessly cryptic and obtuse. The average player will go through the game without even realizing these things exist, which I think is flawed, to say the least. So, to recap, you die a lot, you get desperate, you hit bricks.
Delicious. Yummy.
You get serotonin, your endorphins release, you feel a sense of relief, and the game goes on, rinse and repeat. Small tangent, Akamatsu lists one of his influences for this game as Maze of Gallius, also known as Nightmare 2 on the NES. This game has a ton of destructible objects, rocks and the like, plants, some of which contain items, some of which don't. I'm not going to say they copy-pasted the idea from that game, because that's ridiculous, right? It's just kind of a trope of games of this time. Actually, it's significantly worse in Maze of Gallius. Pretty much every single key item in the game which you need to progress is hidden in some obscure rock in the corner of the map. It's ridiculous. And Castlevania is nowhere near as bad as this. However, it's tedious and weird in that game, and it's kind of the same in Castlevania, but again, it's not as bad. And as if I've gotten this far in the video without talking about the candles, which are pretty similar. Going back to the idea of replayability, you don't know what's in a certain candle until you actually break it.
Oh, there's a dagger in here. I'm just gonna get it out just to see it.
However, once you do, it's always the same. There's a couple exceptions. Here's a clip where you can find a Roman numeral instead of a whip, and sometimes you find a whip. Whatever, I guess sometimes there's a pool of items. And I think that's kind of where this almost beauty comes into it. Each playthrough you find a new wall,
You know what I mean? Oh, I didn't know that was there.
and your knowledge of the game sort of builds up with repeat playthroughs. Even recording this video, I started to learn which candles contained which subweapons and which subweapons I'd want for which bosses, so which candles I'd have to break before fighting which bosses.
Here's where we're gonna get our holy water now. Here we go, holy water.
And eventually you memorize the game, and that's kind of not unique to Castlevania, but still, it's a tradition that's continued through the series. On one hand, it's easy to dismiss hidden walls and things like that as being cheap, although another way to think about them maybe is as a thank you for experienced players, rewards for putting in the time to, quote, master a game. I'm almost certain I haven't found everything in this game, and that's actually quite exciting and keeps the game fresh, even though it's the same game I've been playing since who knows how long, and that's kind of amazing in a way.
Chapter 5.
Failure, self-improvement, and victory. This game is essentially based on a cycle of difficulty. It's not an easy game to complete, and it's definitely not intended to be beaten the first time you play it. But God, if it isn't frustrating. You're gonna die. A lot. Like, a lot. Anyone who's seen the Angry Video Game Nerd knows how infamous this section of the game is. This corridor is full of axe knights who are pretty much very difficult to beat, to put it nicely. Don't even bother doing this without the cross. It'll end up in failure, guaranteed. However, with the cross, it's kind of easier. You can defend yourself against the axes being thrown, as well as the Medusa heads. And just to top it off, the cherry on top of the sundae is The hardest boss in the game is right at the end of this corridor.
Here lies death.
Not only in name, but in the countless times you will fall helplessly beneath his feet. He actually fucking kamikazed me.
Gasping for air as you take your final breath.
Crud. Over and over and over again. I should never have come here. I should never have started this cursed journey. Maybe the world is better off falling into darkness anyway. Maybe it's better off without me. I hate this. I'm pathetic. I'm a monster. And I belong here like any of the other monsters in this castle. I'm a failure. Dude, what the fuck? Who are you?
I think you already know who I am, young one. I'm here for your soul.
My soul? Yeah, I guess there is a hell. So, why have you brought a guitar with you exactly?
Well, funny story actually. See, I was kind of in a rush to get here. I left my scythe at home, couldn't find it, so I brought my axe instead.
Do you want a jam?
What did you just say? But you weren't scared of me or anything?
Well, I mean, you know, since COVID and what have you, I bet you haven't jammed in months, right? Come on, let's do it.
Don't say that word, you idiot. It'll get us demonetized.
Bold of you to assume that I'm monetized anyway. Oh, and just so you're aware, mate, we both know that shirt's too small for you, alright?
Dude, honestly, that's kind of fucking rude, to be honest.
Hey, you didn't answer me anyway. Do you want to jam or not, dude? You've already brought your guitar. Let's go, man.
Well, I've not really got anything else going on today.
Yeah, fuck it, go on, man. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video if you've made it this far. Genuinely very deeply appreciate it if you have. Yeah, today is the 29th of October and I'm about to start editing the video. Yikes. I'm gonna need this to help me through the video, let's put it that way. And I have no fingernails, so I have a cool technique that I like to use where I take a guitar pick, because I have plenty of those, no nails but plenty of these, wedge it under there and just like that. Preferably without making a mess. Yeah, hopefully this will get me through the editing process. Thanks again for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one.